name is Rosa Martinez. I'm 48 years old, and the moment I knew everything had to change was when I overheard them talking about me in the conference room while I was emptying their trash cans. Three men in expensive suits, discussing quarterly profits while I quietly worked around them like I was invisible. When suddenly one of them said, "Maybe we should get Rosa to clean up this mess too, since that's all she's good for anyway." They all laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world, and I just stood there holding a bag full of their leftover lunch containers, pretending I hadn't heard every word. But I had, and something inside me shifted that day from hurt to determination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'd been cleaning the Meridian Corporate Tower for 7 years, arriving every morning at 5:30 before anyone else showed up, mopping floors that would be dirty again by noon, scrubbing toilets for executives who wouldn't even make eye contact with me in the elevator. My uniform was always pressed, my cleaning cart organized, and my work thorough, because my mama raised me to take pride in everything I did, even if others didn't see the value in it. But lately the comments had gotten worse, more frequent, like they'd forgotten I was a person with feelings and dreams just like them. The worst part wasn't even the disrespect itself, it was how casual it had become. Sandra from accounting would leave passive-aggressive notes about how I'd missed a spot on her desk, even though I cleaned it perfectly every single day. The marketing team would have loud conversations about how they wished the building management would hire more professional staff, while I was literally standing right there organizing their supply closet. And don't even get me started on how they'd talk over me whenever I tried to ask if they needed anything moved before I vacuumed around their desks. I lived in a cramped studio apartment 15 minutes from the tower, taking 2 buses each way because I couldn't afford a car on my cleaning salary. Every night I'd come home with aching knees and chemical-burned hands, heat up a frozen dinner, and count the tips I'd managed to save in an old coffee tin under my bed. It wasn't much, maybe $20 or $30 a week, but I'd been doing it for years because I had this crazy dream that someday I'd have enough to start my own cleaning business, maybe hire other women like me who needed steady work and fair treatment. The morning after the conference room incident, I walked into work differently. Not angry, not upset, just focused in a way I hadn't been before. I cleaned every office with extra attention, listened to every conversation a little more carefully, and started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. Like how much these companies were paying in rent, how often spaces sat empty between tenants, and how the building management seemed to struggle with keeping good tenants long-term. During my lunch break, I sat in the parking garage with my sandwich and pulled out my phone to research something I'd been curious about for months. The Meridian Corporate Tower had been for sale for almost 2 years, and the price kept dropping. What started at $12 million was now down to $8.5 million, and from what I could see online, the current owner was getting desperate. The building was only 60% occupied, maintenance issues were piling up, and several major tenants had already announced they were moving out when their leases expired. I knew every inch of this building better than anyone else who worked here. I knew which elevators broke down most often, which floors had the best natural light, where the plumbing problems were worst, and exactly what needed to be fixed to make this place attractive to quality tenants again. While everyone else just saw me as the cleaning lady, I'd been unconsciously conducting the most thorough building inspection possible for 7 years straight. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I went to the public library and checked out every book I could find about real estate investing, property management, and commercial building ownership. I spent both Saturday and Sunday reading until my eyes hurt, taking notes in a composition notebook, and slowly realizing that my dream didn't have to be small. Maybe I didn't need to start with a cleaning business at all. Maybe I could think bigger, be bolder, and turn my years of invisible expertise into something nobody could ignore. Monday morning came and I was back at work, but everything looked different now. Instead of just seeing dirty floors and overflowing trash cans, I was seeing potential revenue streams and operational improvements. I started documenting everything: which companies paid their rent late, which floors had the highest turnover, which spaces stayed vacant longest, and what the common complaints were among tenants. I wasn't just cleaning anymore, I was researching. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later when I overheard a phone conversation between Mr. Peterson, the building manager, and what sounded like his boss. They were talking about foreclosure proceedings, something about the owner missing mortgage payments, and how they had maybe 60 days to find a buyer or the bank would take over. I finished vacuuming his office while he talked, and when he hung up, he looked at me like he'd forgotten I was there and said, "Rosa, you've been here a long time, right? You ever think about what you'd do if this place closed down?" I told him I'd probably find another building to clean, but inside I was thinking something completely different. That night I went home and called the number I'd found online for commercial real estate loans. The woman who answered was polite but skeptical when I explained my situation. She told me that typically, buyers need at least 20% down for commercial properties, which would mean I'd need almost $2 million just to get started. I thanked her and hung up, but I wasn't discouraged. If anything, I was more determined because now I had a specific target. I started working extra shifts wherever I could find them. Evenings at a medical office building across town, weekends at a small law firm, any cleaning work that paid cash and didn't interfere with my main job. I cut my expenses down to almost nothing, eating rice and beans most nights, walking instead of taking the bus when weather permitted, and selling everything I owned that wasn't absolutely necessary. My neighbors probably thought I'd lost my mind, working 16-hour days and living like a monk, but I had a goal now that kept me motivated even when my body wanted to quit. The real turning point came when I met Elena Vasquez at the medical building where I'd been working evenings. She was a nurse practitioner who always stayed late doing paperwork, and unlike most people, she actually talked to me like a human being. We got to chatting one night while I cleaned around her desk, and somehow the conversation turned to real estate. When I told her about my goal to buy the Meridian Tower, I expected her to laugh or tell me I was being unrealistic. Instead, she got excited and started asking detailed questions about the building's financials and my research. It turned out Elena had been looking for investment opportunities and had some money saved up from a settlement after a car accident a few years back. She'd been too scared to invest it alone, but the idea of partnering with someone who knew a property inside and out appealed to her. We started meeting for coffee on Sunday mornings, going over my notebooks full of observations and her research into commercial lending options. She'd bring her laptop and show me comparable property sales, while I'd explain the building's operational challenges and potential solutions. Elena introduced me to her cousin Miguel, who worked as a contractor and had been looking to expand into property rehabilitation. The three of us formed an unlikely partnership. Elena would provide most of the down payment capital.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Miguel would handle the renovation work at cost, plus a small profit, and I would manage the day-to-day operations and tenant relations. We spent months working out the details, getting pre-approved for financing, and developing a business plan that actually made sense. The hardest part was keeping it secret at work. Every day I'd show up with my cleaning cart and uniform, listening to the same people who'd been disrespecting me for years, all while knowing I was potentially weeks away from becoming their landlord. The temptation to say something was overwhelming, especially when Sandra from accounting made another snide comment about how I needed to, quote, pay more attention to detail, or when the marketing team complained loudly about the building's maintenance issues that I'd been documenting and planning to fix. Our offer was submitted on a Thursday morning in October. $8.2 million, with a 30-day closing period and a detailed renovation plan that addressed every major issue the building had. I went to work that day like normal, cleaned every office, emptied every trash can, and smiled politely at everyone who treated me like I was invisible. But inside, I was counting down hours until we'd hear back from the seller. The call came Friday afternoon while I was mopping the lobby floor. Elena texted me that our offer had been accepted, and we had a deal pending financing approval and inspection. I had to lean on my mop for support because my knees went weak with excitement and terror all at once. After 7 years of being invisible in this building, I was about to own it. The inspection period was nerve-wracking because even though I knew the building better than anyone, having everything officially documented and verified felt different. Miguel walked through every floor with the inspector, confirming issues I'd been noting in my composition book for months. The electrical system needed updating on floors 3 and 7, the HVAC units on the top 2 floors were nearing end of life, and the parking garage had drainage problems that caused flooding during heavy rains. Everything I'd observed was accurate, which gave me confidence that my operational assessments were solid too. Financing approval took longer than expected because our partnership structure was unusual and I didn't have traditional business experience on paper. But Elena's credit score was excellent. Miguel had a solid track record with smaller renovation projects, and our business plan was thorough enough to convince the bank that we knew what we were doing. The loan officer seemed surprised by how detailed my knowledge of the building was, and I could tell he was starting to see me as more than just someone who cleaned offices. 3 weeks before closing, I finally told my supervisor, Mrs. Chen, that I'd be leaving my position. She seemed genuinely surprised and asked if I'd found a better cleaning job somewhere else. When I told her I was going to be focusing on property management, she nodded politely, but I could tell she didn't really understand what that meant. I didn't elaborate because I wanted to save the big reveal for after everything was official. The closing day was surreal. I wore my best dress, the one I'd bought for my daughter's graduation 3 years earlier, and met Elena and Miguel at the title company office. We signed what felt like hundreds of papers, transferred more money than I'd ever seen in my life, and walked out as the official owners of the Meridian Corporate Tower. I had to keep reminding myself it was real, that the building where I'd been invisible for 7 years now belonged to our partnership. That weekend, we celebrated with Elena's family at her house, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in an accomplishment that nobody could diminish or dismiss. But the real satisfaction was still to come, because Monday morning I'd be walking back into that building for the first time, as an owner instead of an employee. I decided not to announce the ownership change immediately. Instead, I wanted to spend a few weeks observing how things operated from the other side, understanding the tenant relationships, and building operations from a management perspective. I hired a temporary cleaning service to handle my old duties and set up a small office in the building's former storage room on the ground floor. The first major decision we made was to address the maintenance issues that had been ignored for years. Miguel brought in his crew to start working on the electrical updates and HVAC repairs, while I focused on improving tenant satisfaction and communication. I introduced myself to business owners on each floor as the new building manager, and most of them seemed relieved to have someone who was actually responsive to their concerns. Sandra from accounting was one of the first people to test my patience in my new role. She called the management office to complain about construction noise during business hours and demanded to know why renovations were happening without advance notice. When I explained that we were finally addressing long overdue maintenance issues and that all tenants had been notified by email, she got increasingly agitated and insisted she needed to speak with whoever is actually in charge here. That's when I realized the moment I'd been waiting for had arrived naturally. I told Sandra that she was speaking with the owner, and there was a long pause before she asked what I meant. I explained clearly that I was one of the 3 partners who had recently purchased the building and that all management decisions were going through me. The silence on the phone was so long I thought the call had dropped until she finally asked, "Rosa, the cleaning lady, Rosa?" Word spread quickly after that conversation. By the end of the week, I'd had similar conversations with half the tenants in the building, most of whom seemed genuinely shocked to learn that the woman who used to empty their trash cans now owned the property they worked in. Some were embarrassed about how they'd treated me over the years, others were professional and seemed impressed by the improvements we were already making, and a few were clearly struggling to adjust their perception of who I was. The marketing team that had always complained about building maintenance suddenly became very friendly, stopping by my office to chat about their lease renewal and asking if there were any upcoming improvements they should know about. I was polite but professional, focusing on their business needs rather than relitigating past disrespect. However, I made sure they understood that all future maintenance requests should be submitted through proper channels, and that casual complaints in the hallway weren't an effective communication method. Mr. Peterson, the building manager I'd replaced, came by during his final week to hand over keys and records. He seemed genuinely impressed by how quickly we'd identified and started addressing operational issues, and he admitted that he'd always known I paid attention to details but hadn't realized how comprehensive my understanding of the building was. He also mentioned that several tenants had already commented positively about the changes in communication and responsiveness since the ownership transition. The most satisfying moment came about a month after we'd taken ownership, when the 3 executives whose conference room conversation had sparked my determination walked into my office to discuss their lease renewal. They needed additional space for their expanding team, and their current lease was set to expire in 6 months. They clearly recognized me but seemed unsure how to address the dramatic change in our relationship. I kept the meeting professional and focused on their business needs, presenting options for expanding into adjacent suites and explaining our planned improvements to the building's technology infrastructure. But when they started negotiating rent prices with the same dismissive attitude they'd always used with me, I calmly reminded them that this was a business discussion between equals and that their tone needed to reflect that reality. By the end of the meeting, we'd reached an agreement that was fair for both sides, but I could tell they were still processing the fact that the woman they joked about was now in a position to determine whether their business could stay in the building or not. I didn't gloat or make them feel worse than they already did, but I also didn't pretend that their past behavior hadn't happened. Over the following months, our renovation work transformed the building's reputation in the local business community. We'd addressed the electrical and HVAC issues, improved the lobby and common areas, upgraded security systems, and implemented better communication systems for tenant services. Our occupancy rate climbed from 60% to 85% within the first year, and we were able to attract higher quality tenants who appreciated the professional management approach. Elena proved to be an excellent partner, handling the financial aspects of property management while I focused on operations and tenant relations. Miguel's renovation work was top quality and came in under budget, allowing us to reinvest savings into additional improvements that further increased the building's value. Our partnership worked because each of us contributed different skills and perspectives that complemented each other perfectly. The financial success exceeded our projections. Within 18 months, the property had appreciated enough that we were able to refinance at better terms and take some equity out to start looking at additional investment opportunities. Elena wanted to expand into residential properties. Miguel was interested in purchasing buildings that needed more extensive renovation work, and I was drawn to undervalued commercial properties where hands-on management could create significant value. But beyond the financial rewards, the most meaningful change was in how I saw myself and how others perceived me. I was no longer invisible, no longer someone whose expertise and intelligence were dismissed because of my job title. I'd proven that paying attention, working hard, and thinking strategically could overcome educational credentials and social assumptions about what people from my background could achieve. The building that had once been the site of daily humiliation became the foundation of my transformation into a successful businesswoman. Every morning when I walked through the lobby that I now owned, I remembered the woman who used to mop these floors before dawn while dreaming of something bigger. She'd been right to keep believing, right to keep working, and right to bet on herself when nobody else would. Today, 3 years later, our partnership owns 4 commercial properties in the city, provides jobs for 12 people, and has helped dozens of small businesses find affordable, well-managed office space. I still remember exactly what it felt like to be dismissed and underestimated, which helps me treat every employee and tenant with the respect I once wished someone had shown me. Sometimes former tenants from the original building stop by to say hello when they're in the neighborhood, and most of them seem genuinely happy about my success. Sandra from accounting even referred a friend's business to one of our other properties, which I took as a sign that people can change their perspectives when given the opportunity. The executives from that conference room conversation turned out to be good tenants who renewed their lease twice before eventually outgrowing our building and moving to a larger space. Our final meeting was cordial and professional, and one of them mentioned that working with me had taught him to pay more attention to all the people who contribute to making businesses run smoothly. I kept one small reminder of my cleaning days, the composition notebook where I'd written my first observations about the building's potential. It sits on my desk next to contracts and financial reports, reminding me that valuable insights can come from unexpected places, and that being underestimated can actually be an advantage if you're patient enough to use it strategically. The woman who once emptied trash cans and mopped floors in anonymity became someone who creates opportunities, builds wealth, and proves that intelligence and determination matter more than other people's assumptions about your potential. And every morning when I unlock the front doors of my buildings, I think about my mama's advice that taking pride in your work, no matter what it is, always leads to something better if you keep your eyes open for the opportunities. The first real test of my new position came 6 months after we'd taken ownership, when I discovered that 3 of our most problematic tenants were actually connected in ways that had been costing the building money for years. It started when I noticed irregularities in the utility billing for the law offices on the 4th floor. They'd been consistently reporting lower square footage than what I knew their space actually was, which meant they'd been underpaying for electricity and water for almost 3 years. When I pulled the original lease agreements and compared them to the actual floor plans I'd memorized during my cleaning days, I found discrepancies that totaled almost $15,000 in unpaid utilities. But what really caught my attention was that all 3 questionable leases had been negotiated by the same property management company that had been running the building before we bought it. The same company that had let maintenance slide, ignored tenant complaints, and somehow never noticed these billing errors. I spent weeks going through every lease in the building, cross-referencing square footage claims with actual measurements, and what I discovered made my stomach turn. At least 6 tenants had been systematically underreporting their space usage, and in every case, the discrepancies had been approved or overlooked by the previous management company. We weren't just dealing with honest mistakes or outdated records, we were dealing with what looked like intentional fraud. Elena and I met with our attorney to discuss the situation, and he explained that we had grounds to demand back payments plus penalties for the utility underpayments, but pursuing it would likely mean losing those tenants and potentially facing lengthy legal battles. The safer route would be to correct the billing going forward and negotiate payment plans for the outstanding amounts. But something about the whole situation bothered me beyond just the money. I decided to do some research into the previous management company, Hartwell Property Services, and what I found explained a lot about why the building had been struggling financially when we bought it. They'd been managing properties throughout the city for over 20 years, but their track record was full of buildings that had declined in value, experienced high tenant turnover, and eventually been sold at below market prices. In every case, certain tenants seemed to get favorable treatment, while building maintenance and accurate record-keeping suffered. The pattern became clearer when I discovered that Marcus Hartwell, who owned the management company, was also a silent partner in several small businesses that rented space in buildings he managed. He'd been using his position to give his own ventures below-market rents and reduced utility obligations while letting the buildings deteriorate around them. The previous owners of our building probably never knew they were being systematically cheated by their own property manager. I brought this information to Elena and Miguel, and we decided to take a more aggressive approach than our attorney had initially recommended. We weren't just going to correct the billing errors and move on. We were going to document everything we'd found and make sure other property owners in the city knew what Hartwell had been doing. This wasn't just about our building anymore, it was about stopping a pattern of corruption that had probably cost dozens of property owners hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. The confrontation with the law offices, on the 4th floor, was my first experience dealing with tenants who knew they'd been caught but had no intention of admitting it. When I presented them with the evidence of their underpayments, they immediately became defensive and started making threats about breaking their lease early and damaging our occupancy rate. The senior partner, a man named Davidson who'd never acknowledged my existence during my cleaning days, suddenly became very concerned about maintaining a good working relationship. I listened to his attempts to negotiate and minimize the situation, but I kept thinking about all the times I'd cleaned around his desk while he'd made jokes about the building's poor management and high operating costs. He'd known exactly why those costs were high, because he'd been contributing to the problem while pretending to be a victim of it. When he finished his speech about being a long-term tenant who deserved consideration, I calmly presented him with 2 options: full repayment of outstanding amounts plus corrected billing going forward, or lease termination with 30 days' notice. He chose to pay, but not without making it clear that he felt we were being unreasonable and that he'd be looking for other office space as soon as his lease expired. I told him that was his choice, but that we'd be happy to provide references for his business practices to any future landlords who requested them. The conversation ended quickly after that, and within a week we received a check for the full amount owed plus agreed-upon penalties. Word of our aggressive approach to the billing corrections spread quickly through the building, and I started getting calls from other tenants who wanted to discuss their leases proactively, rather than wait for us to discover problems. Most of these conversations were straightforward corrections that people were happy to resolve cooperatively, but a few revealed additional issues that made me realize how deep the previous mismanagement had gone. The marketing firm on the 7th floor had been subletting part of their space to a graphic design freelancer without permission and without reporting the additional occupancy for utility billing. The accounting office on the 3rd floor had been using a storage room that wasn't included in their lease agreement as a file archive for over 2 years. And the consulting group on the 6th floor had been running a side business selling imported goods out of their office space, which violated both their lease terms and city zoning regulations. Each discovery reinforced my growing understanding that successful property management wasn't just about maintaining buildings and collecting rent. It was about establishing clear standards and enforcing them consistently. The previous management had created a culture where rules were flexible, documentation was poor, and problems were ignored until they became expensive. We were changing that culture one lease correction at a time. But the real revelation came when I decided to investigate why our building had been on the market for almost 2 years before we bought it. I reached out to several commercial real estate agents in the city and asked them about the property's history. What I learned was that Hartwell Property Services had been actively discouraging potential buyers by providing misleading information about occupancy rates, maintenance costs, and tenant stability. According to one agent who'd shown the building multiple times, Hartwell had consistently painted a picture of the property as more troubled than it actually was, emphasizing every maintenance issue while downplaying the building's strong location and solid construction. He'd told prospective buyers that major tenants were planning to leave, that renovation costs would be prohibitive, and that the neighborhood was declining in desirability for office space. At the time, this had seemed like honesty about the building's challenges, but now I realized it was a deliberate strategy to keep the sale price low. Hartwell had been hoping to arrange for one of his investor partners to buy the property at a discount, probably with plans to continue the same management practices that had been enriching him at the previous owner's expense. Our unexpected bid had disrupted that plan, but it also meant we'd inherited a mess that was even more complicated than we'd originally understood. I decided it was time to have a direct conversation with Marcus Hartwell himself. I called his office and scheduled a meeting under the pretense of discussing the transition of remaining management responsibilities. When I walked into his downtown office, I could see the surprise on his face as he recognized me as the former cleaning lady from the Meridian Tower. He recovered quickly and put on his professional demeanor, but I could tell he was wondering how much I actually knew about his business practices. The meeting started with polite small talk about the building's transition to new ownership, but I quickly steered the conversation toward the billing discrepancies we'd discovered. I watched his face carefully as I described the utility underpayments, the unreported subletting arrangements, and the pattern of favorable treatment for certain tenants. He maintained his composure, but I could see him calculating how much trouble he might be in. When I told him that we'd be reporting our findings to the State Real Estate Commission and sharing information with other property owners who'd used his services, his professional mask slipped completely. He started making excuses about outdated record-keeping systems and honest mistakes, but when that didn't seem to convince me, he shifted to making veiled threats about how difficult it could be for new property owners to succeed without experienced guidance. That's when I realized that Marcus Hartwell saw me exactly the same way the corporate executives had seen me during my cleaning days. He assumed that because I didn't have formal business education or real estate experience, I could be intimidated or manipulated into backing down. He was wrong about that, just like they'd been wrong about my potential to succeed in business ownership. I let him finish his implied threats, and then calmly explained that we'd already documented everything we'd found, shared it with our attorney, and begun reaching out to other property owners in his client portfolio. I told him that his reputation in the industry was going to depend on how he handled the situation from this point forward. He could cooperate with correcting the problems he'd created, or he could face public exposure of his business practices, along with potential legal action from multiple clients. The conversation ended with him agreeing to provide complete records for all the questionable lease arrangements and to cooperate with our efforts to correct the billing errors. He also agreed to send letters to other property owners he'd managed, disclosing potential similar issues and offering to help resolve them. It wasn't exactly an admission of guilt, but it was enough to prevent him from continuing the same practices with other clients. After that meeting, I felt a shift in how I approached challenges related to our property business. Instead of worrying about whether I had enough experience or credentials to handle complex situations, I started trusting my instincts and focusing on gathering information systematically. The skills I'd developed during my cleaning years, attention to detail, persistence, and careful observation, turned out to be exactly what I needed for successful property management. The building's reputation in the local business community began to improve as word spread about our professional approach to management and our commitment to maintaining high standards for both the property and tenant relationships. We started getting inquiries from businesses that had never considered our location before, and our occupancy rate climbed steadily as leases came up for renewal and tenants chose to stay rather than move elsewhere. Elena's background in healthcare administration proved invaluable as we developed systems for tracking maintenance requests, monitoring tenant satisfaction, and managing the financial aspects of property ownership. She had experience with regulatory compliance and documentation requirements that translated perfectly to commercial real estate management. Miguel's renovation work was attracting attention from other property owners, and he was getting requests to bid on projects throughout the city. Our partnership was evolving beyond the single building we'd started with. Elena had found another property that was being mismanaged by a different company, and the patterns were similar to what we discovered at the Meridian Tower. Tenants were frustrated with poor communication and deferred maintenance. Occupancy was declining, and the building was underperforming financially despite its good location and solid construction. I spent several weeks researching the second property, talking to current and former tenants, and analyzing its operational challenges. The building was smaller than our first acquisition, only 8 floors instead of 12, but it had better parking and more modern infrastructure. The asking price was reasonable, and the seller seemed motivated to close quickly rather than continue dealing with management headaches. We made an offer that was accepted within a week, and suddenly we were expanding from property owners to property management company operators. I hired 2 part-time employees to help with administrative tasks and tenant communications, and Miguel brought in additional crew members to handle maintenance and renovation work across multiple buildings. The second acquisition taught me that our success with the first building hadn't been luck or beginner's fortune. It had been the result of applying systematic attention to operational details that other property managers were overlooking or ignoring. Every building had inefficiencies and problems that could be identified and corrected by someone who was willing to spend time understanding how the property actually functioned day to day. But managing multiple properties also brought new challenges that I hadn't anticipated. Coordinating maintenance schedules, tracking different lease terms and tenant needs, and maintaining the high level of personal attention that had made our first building successful required better systems and more sophisticated planning than I'd needed before. I enrolled in a property management certification program at the community college, not because I felt inadequate, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing important legal or financial considerations as we expanded. The classes were mostly filled with people who were starting their careers in real estate, and I was often the oldest student in the room, but the instructors treated me with respect and seemed genuinely interested in learning from my practical experience. The most valuable part of the certification program wasn't the textbook knowledge, it was the networking opportunities with other property professionals and the chance to share strategies with people who were facing similar challenges. I met several other property owners who had discovered billing irregularities or management problems similar to what we'd found, and we started informally sharing information about problematic management companies and contractors. 6 months into managing our second building, I got a call that would change everything again. Carol Kim, a commercial real estate agent I'd worked with during our acquisitions, told me about a portfolio of 4 buildings that was going to market due to an estate sale. The buildings were all in good locations, but they'd been under the same ownership for over 30 years and needed updating to attract modern tenants. The portfolio was too large for our partnership to handle alone, but Carol suggested that we might be interested in forming a larger investment group with other experienced property managers. She'd identified several potential partners who had complementary skills and access to additional capital, and she thought our track record with problem properties would make us attractive partners for a larger deal. Elena, Miguel, and I spent weeks analyzing the financial projections and visiting each of the 4 buildings. 2 of them were in excellent condition and fully occupied with long-term tenants, One needed moderate renovation but had good bones and strong rental potential, and one was a complete disaster that had been essentially abandoned for over a year after a major tenant bankruptcy. The abandoned building was what made the deal interesting for us. While other investors saw it as a liability that reduced the portfolio's overall value, we saw it as an opportunity to apply the same systematic approach that had worked for our previous acquisitions. The building's problems were obvious and well documented, which meant they could be addressed with proper planning and sufficient investment. We joined the investment group as managing partners for the portfolio, with responsibility for day-to-day operations and renovation oversight. Elena handled the financial structuring and investor relations, Miguel managed the construction and renovation projects, and I focused on tenant relations and operational improvements across all 4 properties. The abandoned building became our showcase project. We spent 8 months completely renovating it, updating all the mechanical systems, redesigning the floor plans for modern office needs, and creating common areas that would appeal to creative businesses and technology companies. The transformation was dramatic, and it attracted attention from local business publications and commercial real estate industry publications. More importantly, it established our reputation as property managers who could successfully tackle challenging projects that other companies avoided. We started getting calls from other property owners who had problem buildings, and we began offering consulting services in addition to our direct ownership and management activities. The success of the portfolio acquisition led to opportunities I'd never imagined during my cleaning days. I was invited to speak at real estate investment conferences, appointed to a city planning committee focused on downtown revitalization, and approached by banks who wanted to discuss financing for larger commercial real estate projects. But the most satisfying moment came 2 years after we'd joined the investment group, when I was recognized as Commercial Property Manager of the Year by the local real estate association. The award ceremony was held at the Meridian Tower, in the same conference room where I'd once overheard executives joking about my capabilities. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of successful business professionals who now respected my expertise and sought my advice, I thought about the journey from invisible cleaning lady to recognized industry leader. It had taken persistence, careful observation, strategic thinking, and the willingness to bet on myself when nobody else would. But most importantly, it had required refusing to accept other people's assumptions about my potential and staying focused on building something meaningful, regardless of their expectations. The woman who had once emptied trash cans in anonymity was now creating opportunities for other people, mentoring emerging property managers, and proving that success comes from understanding how systems really work, rather than just knowing how they're supposed to work on paper. Every morning when I walked through the lobbies of our buildings, I remembered exactly what it had felt like to be dismissed and overlooked, and I used that memory to make sure nobody in our organization ever experienced that kind of treatment. The phone call that would test everything I'd built came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing lease applications for our newest building. The voice on the other end was professional but tense, introducing herself as Detective Maria Santos from the Financial Crimes Division. She asked if I could come downtown to discuss some irregularities that had been discovered in connection with properties I managed, and my stomach immediately dropped. I called Elena and our attorney before heading to the police station, trying to keep my voice steady while explaining that we were apparently under investigation for something I couldn't even guess at. Elena offered to come with me, but I decided it would be better to handle the initial meeting alone and get a clear picture of what we were dealing with before involving anyone else in potential legal trouble. Detective Santos was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of direct manner that made it clear she didn't waste time on small talk. She spread several folders across the conference room table and explained that they'd been investigating a network of real estate fraud that involved multiple properties throughout the city. Our names had come up because several of the buildings in question had connections to properties we managed or had acquired. The investigation had started when a former employee of Hartwell Property Services contacted the fraud unit with evidence that Marcus Hartwell had been systematically defrauding property owners for over a decade. The employee, a bookkeeper named Patricia Williams, had kept copies of altered lease agreements, falsified maintenance records, and financial documents that showed how tenants were paying Hartwell directly for below-market rents, while property owners received reports showing lower occupancy and higher operating costs. Detective Santos showed me photographs of documents I recognized from our own investigation into the billing irregularities at the Meridian Tower. Patricia Williams had been the person who'd prepared many of the fraudulent reports, and she'd finally decided to come forward when she learned that several property owners had lost their buildings to foreclosure due to financial problems that Hartwell's schemes had created or worsened. But what made my blood run cold was learning that our success in exposing Hartwell's practices had apparently triggered a more sophisticated retaliation than I'd anticipated. According to Detective Santos, someone had been filing false complaints about our management practices with city inspectors, making anonymous reports about building code violations that didn't exist, and even attempting to interfere with our financing relationships by spreading rumors about financial irregularities in our business operations. The detective explained that they needed my cooperation because Patricia Williams had identified me as one of the property owners who'd been most aggressive in pursuing documentation of Hartwell's fraudulent practices. They wanted me to review the evidence they'd collected and help them understand how the schemes had worked from a victim's perspective. But they also needed to investigate whether any of our business practices had crossed legal lines in our efforts to recover stolen money. I spent 3 hours going through documents that told a story of systematic theft that was much larger and more organized than I'd realized. Hartwell hadn't been working alone. He'd been part of a network that included corrupt building inspectors who would overlook problems in exchange for payments, contractors who would inflate repair costs and split the overcharges, and even some tenants who were willing to participate in fraudulent lease arrangements in exchange for below-market rents. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Over 15 years, the network had stolen an estimated $3.7 million from property owners throughout the city. Some owners had lost their buildings entirely when fabricated maintenance crises and inflated operating costs made it impossible to keep up with mortgage payments. Others had sold properties at below-market prices after being convinced that their buildings were more troubled than they actually were. Detective Santos asked me to explain how I'd discovered the problems at our building and what steps we'd taken to address them. I walked her through my investigation process, from noticing the utility billing discrepancies to confronting tenants about unreported space usage to researching Hartwell's business practices. She took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions that made it clear she understood both the financial and operational aspects of property management. When I finished explaining our approach, she was quiet for several minutes before asking whether I'd ever considered that my background as a cleaning person might have given me insights that other property owners had missed. I told her that my years of working in the building had definitely helped me understand how space was actually being used versus how it was being reported, but that I'd never thought about it as a special advantage until I started managing properties myself. The detective's next question surprised me. She asked if I'd be willing to help with the broader investigation by reviewing documents from other properties and identifying patterns that someone with my operational experience might recognize. The fraud unit was dealing with hundreds of suspicious transactions and lease arrangements, and they needed help from someone who understood both the legitimate and illegitimate ways that building operations could be manipulated. I agreed to help, but I also asked what kind of legal exposure our partnership might face for the aggressive tactics we'd use to recover money from fraudulent tenants. Detective Santos explained that everything we'd done appeared to be within legal bounds, but that the investigation might require us to testify about our experiences and provide access to our financial records to demonstrate that we hadn't been participants in any of the fraudulent schemes. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Elena and Miguel to explain what I'd learned. Elena was horrified by the scope of the fraud network, but she was also concerned about how the investigation might affect our business operations and our relationships with current tenants. Miguel was angry that his renovation work might be scrutinized as part of the investigation, especially since he'd always been careful to document his costs and labor honestly. Our attorney recommended that we cooperate fully with the investigation, while also being prepared for the possibility that our business practices would be examined closely by people who might not understand the property management industry. He also suggested that we prepare for negative publicity if the investigation became public, since our names would likely be mentioned in connection with the fraud network even though we were victims. rather than perpetrators. The next few months were incredibly stressful as I balanced my regular business responsibilities with frequent meetings with investigators and prosecutors. I reviewed hundreds of documents, identified suspicious patterns in lease agreements and maintenance records, and helped the fraud unit understand how property management systems could be manipulated to hide theft and inflate costs. The investigation revealed that the fraud network had been much more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. Hartwell and his associates had developed systems for creating false identities for shell companies, manipulating city inspection records, and even bribing bank employees to approve loans based on falsified property valuations. The scheme had operated successfully for so long because it appeared legitimate on the surface, and because most property owners trusted their management companies to handle operational details honestly. My cooperation with the investigation earned me respect from law enforcement officials, but it also made me a target for retaliation from people who were still connected to the fraud network. I started receiving threatening phone calls, someone vandalized my car twice, and there were several incidents of suspicious activity around our buildings that made me concerned about the safety of our tenants and employees. Detective Santos arranged for increased security around our properties and advised me to vary my daily routines and be cautious about meeting with people I didn't know well. She also warned me that the investigation was likely to continue for at least another year, and that I should expect to testify in multiple criminal trials once arrests were made. The stress of the investigation began affecting my health and my relationships with Elena and Miguel. I was working longer hours, sleeping poorly, and constantly worried about what new revelations might emerge about the fraud network's activities. Elena was concerned that the negative publicity might damage our reputation with potential tenants and investors, while Miguel was frustrated that his legitimate renovation work was being questioned by people who seemed to assume that anyone connected to the investigation must be guilty of something. The breakthrough in the case came when Patricia Williams led investigators to a storage unit where Hartwell had kept backup copies of altered documents dating back over a decade. The storage unit contained evidence of fraud involving more than 60 properties and over 200 individual transactions. It also contained proof that several city officials had been receiving payments in exchange for overlooking building code violations and approving permits for work that was never actually completed. The evidence from the storage unit was so overwhelming that Hartwell and 6 of his associates were arrested within a week. The arrests were covered extensively by local news media, and our names were mentioned prominently as property owners who had helped expose the fraud network. While I was relieved that the criminal aspects of the case were moving forward, I was also concerned about how the publicity might affect our business operations. The news coverage was actually more positive than I'd expected. Several reporters portrayed our story as an example of how property owners could protect themselves by paying attention to operational details and being willing to investigate irregularities rather than simply accepting management company reports. The articles emphasized that we'd been victims of the fraud who had taken action to expose it, rather than participants who had benefited from it. But the publicity also brought unwanted attention from other directions. Several property owners who'd worked with Hartwell contacted us asking for help investigating their own buildings for signs of fraud. A few were genuine requests for assistance, but others seemed to be fishing for information about the ongoing investigation or looking for ways to blame their own financial problems on fraudulent management practices. I decided to be selective about which property owners I was willing to help, focusing on cases where the evidence of fraud was clear and where my assistance might actually make a difference. Elena and Miguel were supportive of this approach, but they also reminded me that our primary responsibility was to our own business and our own tenants, not to serve as unpaid consultants for every property owner who suspected they'd been cheated. The criminal trials began 8 months after the arrests, and testifying was one of the most difficult experiences of my professional life. Defense attorneys tried to portray me as an inexperienced property owner who had misunderstood normal business practices and jumped to conclusions about fraud that didn't actually exist. They questioned my qualifications to evaluate lease agreements and financial records, suggested that my background as a cleaning person made me unsuitable for property management, and implied that I was seeking attention and sympathy by exaggerating the scope of the problems I'd discovered. I had prepared for these attacks with help from the prosecutor and our attorney, but hearing my intelligence and credibility questioned in such a public forum was still painful. The defense attorneys were using the same dismissive attitude that I'd encountered throughout my cleaning career, assuming that my lack of formal business education meant I couldn't understand complex financial arrangements or identify legitimate irregularities. But my testimony held up under cross-examination because it was based on detailed documentation and systematic analysis, rather than assumptions or emotional reactions. I'd kept meticulous records of every discrepancy I'd discovered, every conversation I'd had with tenants and vendors, and every step I'd taken to verify information. The prosecutor was able to use my documentation to corroborate Patricia Williams' testimony and demonstrate how the fraud network had operated. The trials lasted 6 months, and all 7 defendants were convicted on multiple felony charges including fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Hartwell received the longest sentence, 8 years in federal prison, while his associates received sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years. Several city officials who had accepted bribes were convicted in separate trials and also received prison sentences. The convictions were satisfying from a justice perspective, but they didn't immediately solve the practical problems that the fraud network had created for property owners throughout the city. Many buildings were still operating under lease agreements that contained fraudulent terms. Maintenance issues that had been ignored or misrepresented needed to be addressed, and financial relationships with banks and insurance companies had been damaged by years of false reporting. I found myself in the unexpected position of being seen as an expert on property management fraud recovery. Several banks asked me to consult on commercial loans for properties that had been managed by Hartwell's company. Insurance companies wanted my opinion on claims related to fraudulent maintenance reports, and other property management companies sought my advice on implementing systems to prevent similar fraud in their own operations. The consulting work was interesting and financially rewarding, but it also took time away from managing our own properties and pursuing new acquisition opportunities. Elena and Miguel were concerned that I was becoming too focused on fraud-related activities and losing sight of our original goals for building a successful property management business. They were right to be concerned. The fraud investigation and trials had consumed almost 2 years of my attention, and during that time our business growth had slowed significantly. We'd maintained our existing properties well and kept occupancy rates high, but we hadn't pursued new acquisitions or expanded our services in the ways we'd originally planned. I realized that I needed to make a conscious decision about whether to continue focusing on fraud investigation and recovery consulting, or to return my primary attention to building our property management business. The consulting work was important and helped other property owners, but it wasn't building the kind of long-term value that would secure financial independence for Elena, Miguel, and me. After several long discussions with my partners, I decided to limit my fraud consulting work to cases that were directly related to our own properties or that offered significant learning opportunities for our business. We set a goal of acquiring 2 new properties within the next 18 months and expanding our management services to include residential buildings in addition to commercial properties. The reputation we'd gained from exposing the fraud network actually helped with these expansion plans. Property owners who were concerned about management company reliability sought us out specifically because of our track record for honest dealing and attention to operational details. We were able to be selective about which properties and clients we worked with, choosing opportunities that aligned with our strengths and long-term goals. But the most important outcome of the fraud investigation wasn't the business opportunities or public recognition. It was the confidence I'd gained in my own judgment and capabilities. Being able to identify, investigate, and expose a sophisticated fraud network had proven to myself and others that my intelligence and analytical skills were just as valuable as any formal education or professional credentials. The woman, who had once been dismissed as just a cleaning lady, had become someone whose expertise was sought by law enforcement agencies, banks, insurance companies, and fellow property owners. I'd transformed not just my own financial situation, but also my understanding of what I was capable of achieving when I trusted my instincts and was willing to do the detailed work that others avoided. Standing in the conference room of our newest property acquisition, reviewing lease agreements and tenant applications with Elena and Miguel, I reflected on how much had changed since that first day when I'd overheard executives joking about my capabilities. The building we were preparing to renovate had been another victim of fraudulent management, and we were going to restore it to profitability using the same systematic approach that had worked for all our previous projects. The fraud investigation had been a detour that I hadn't expected or wanted, but it had also been a proving ground that established my credibility in ways that normal business success might not have achieved. Now, when I walked into meetings with banks, investors, or city officials, I was treated as an expert whose opinions carried weight and whose recommendations were taken seriously. Every morning when I reviewed the operational reports from our buildings, I remembered exactly what it had felt like to be invisible and underestimated. That memory kept me motivated to continue building something meaningful, not just for my own financial security, but as proof that intelligence and determination could overcome any assumptions about what people from my background were capable of achieving. The moment that brought everything full circle happened on a rainy Thursday morning 3 years after the fraud trials had ended. I was walking through the lobby of the Meridian Tower, checking on some renovation work we were doing to update the elevator systems, when I noticed a familiar figure struggling with several boxes of personal belongings near the security desk. It was Sandra from the accounting firm, the same woman who used to leave passive-aggressive notes about my cleaning and had been one of the most condescending tenants during my invisible years. She looked exhausted and frustrated, clearly in the middle of moving her belongings out of the building. When she saw me approaching, I could see the recognition in her eyes followed immediately by what looked like embarrassment. We hadn't spoken directly since the day I'd revealed my ownership of the building, and I could tell she was uncertain about how to interact with me now that our roles had completely reversed. I asked if she needed help with the boxes, and she explained that her firm was closing down after losing several major clients and struggling with cash flow problems for over a year. The partners had decided to dissolve the business rather than continue operating at a loss, and she was clearing out her personal items before the office furniture was repossessed. There was something in her voice that reminded me of how I'd felt during my most difficult financial periods, and despite our history, I found myself feeling sympathetic. Sandra hesitated for a moment, then asked if she could speak with me privately about something that had been bothering her for a long time. We went to the small coffee shop in the building's ground floor, and she spent several minutes apologizing for how she'd treated me during my cleaning years. She said she'd been going through her own struggles with job insecurity and financial stress, and that taking out her frustrations on someone she perceived as having less power had made her feel temporarily better about her own situation. What surprised me was how genuine her apology seemed. She wasn't trying to get something from me or manipulate me into helping with her current problems. She was simply acknowledging that her behavior had been wrong, and that she'd realized it more clearly as her own circumstances had deteriorated. She told me that watching my transformation from cleaning lady to successful property owner had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own attitudes and assumptions. I accepted her apology, and we ended up talking for over an hour about how people's circumstances can change quickly and unpredictably. She shared that she'd been applying for bookkeeping positions, but was having trouble finding work that paid enough to cover her basic expenses. The accounting field had become more competitive, and her experience was with smaller firms that didn't provide the kind of credentials that larger companies were looking for. Before we parted ways, I mentioned that our property management company was looking for someone with accounting experience to help manage the financial aspects of our expanding portfolio. We needed someone who could handle tenant billing, expense tracking, and financial reporting for multiple properties, and her background seemed like it might be a good fit. I gave her my business card and suggested she submit a resume if she was interested in learning more about the position. Elena was skeptical when I told her about my conversation with Sandra and my suggestion that she apply for our open position. She reminded me that Sandra had been one of the people who'd treated me most poorly during my cleaning years, and she questioned whether someone with that attitude would be a good cultural fit for our company. Miguel was more neutral but agreed that we should be careful about hiring someone whose past behavior suggested she might not respect all members of our team. I understood their concerns, but I also believed that people could change, and that Sandra's apology had seemed sincere. More importantly, I thought there might be value in having someone on our team who had personally experienced the kind of attitude transformation that we hoped to encourage in the broader business community. If Sandra could become a positive example of how people could grow beyond their initial prejudices, it might help other employees and tenants do the same. Sandra submitted her resume within 2 days, along with a cover letter that was more thoughtful and humble than I'd expected. She acknowledged her past behavior directly, explained what she'd learned from the experience, and outlined how her accounting skills could contribute to our company's continued growth. She also mentioned that she'd researched our business practices and was impressed by our reputation for treating all employees and tenants with respect. We interviewed Sandra along with 4 other candidates for the position, and she performed well on both the technical aspects of the job and the interpersonal questions we used to assess cultural fit. She was honest about her past attitudes and articulated clearly how her perspective had changed. She also demonstrated genuine enthusiasm for our company's mission and values, which seemed authentic rather than calculated. After discussing it extensively with Elena and Miguel, we decided to offer Sandra the position with a probationary period that would allow us to evaluate her performance and attitude over several months. We made it clear that any behavior that disrespected colleagues or tenants would result in immediate termination, and she agreed to those terms without hesitation. Sandra's integration into our team exceeded my expectations. She was professional, diligent, and respectful in all her interactions with employees and tenants. She also brought valuable organizational skills that helped us streamline our financial processes and improve our reporting capabilities. Most importantly, she seemed genuinely committed to contributing to the positive culture we'd worked to create. Her transformation became a powerful example for other employees and tenants who had initially been skeptical about our management approach. When someone who had previously embodied the kind of dismissive attitude we were trying to change could adapt and thrive in our environment, it demonstrated that our values weren't just idealistic concepts, but practical guidelines that could work for everyone. The success of Sandra's hiring led us to be more open to giving second chances to other people who had made mistakes or shown poor judgment in the past, as long as they demonstrated genuine willingness to change and contributed positively to our team dynamics. We developed interview processes that focused more on current attitudes and future potential than on past behavior, while still maintaining high standards for professionalism and respect. Our reputation for fair treatment and second chances started attracting job applicants who had been struggling to find work due to various challenges in their backgrounds. We hired a former tenant who had been evicted from another building due to financial problems but had gotten back on his feet, a maintenance worker who had been fired from his previous job due to personality conflicts but showed excellent technical skills, and an administrative assistant who had been unemployed for over a year due to age discrimination in her previous field. Building a team of people who had faced various forms of professional adversity created a work environment that was more empathetic, collaborative, and motivated than any I'd experienced before. Everyone understood what it felt like to be underestimated or dismissed, which made them more committed to treating others with dignity and working together to achieve shared goals. The business benefits of this approach were significant. Our employee turnover was virtually non-existent, our customer service ratings were consistently high, and our reputation for positive workplace culture helped us attract both tenants and investors who wanted to be associated with companies that demonstrated strong values in their operations. But the personal satisfaction of building something that reflected my own values and experiences was even more important than the financial success. Every day when I walked through our properties and saw employees who had been given opportunities to prove themselves, tenants who felt respected and supported, and spaces that were well maintained and efficiently operated, I felt proud of what we'd accomplished together. The culmination of this approach came when we were approached by the city's Economic Development Department about participating in a downtown revitalization initiative. They were looking for property management companies that could take on challenging buildings in underdeveloped areas and transform them into thriving commercial spaces that would attract new businesses and create jobs. The project they offered us was a historic building that had been vacant for over 5 years due to a combination of structural problems, environmental issues, and a location that was considered undesirable by most commercial tenants. The building had beautiful architecture and good bones, but it would require significant investment and creative thinking to make it viable in the current market. Elena, Miguel, and I spent weeks analyzing the opportunity and developing a renovation plan that would preserve the building's historic character while updating it for modern business needs. We proposed creating a mixed-use space that would include traditional office suites, co-working areas for entrepreneurs and freelancers, and ground-floor retail space for local businesses that couldn't afford prime downtown rents. The city approved our proposal and offered favorable financing terms that made the project financially feasible. We also received support from several community organizations that were interested in promoting economic development in the area. The renovation project became our most ambitious undertaking yet, requiring us to coordinate with historic preservation specialists, environmental remediation contractors, and a variety of regulatory agencies. The building's transformation took 18 months and attracted significant media attention as an example of how thoughtful property management could contribute to broader community development goals. We were able to lease the spaces to a diverse mix of tenants, including a nonprofit organization, several small technology companies, a coffee shop, and a bookstore that specialized in works by local authors. The success of the historic building project established our company as a leader in adaptive reuse and community-focused development. We started receiving invitations to bid on similar projects in other cities, and several universities asked me to speak to their real estate and urban planning students about strategies for revitalizing underutilized commercial properties. But the most meaningful recognition came from the tenants and employees who had been part of our journey from the beginning. At our company's 5th anniversary celebration, they presented me with a plaque that read, "To Rosa Martinez, who proved that seeing people's potential is the foundation of all success." The inscription captured exactly what I'd been trying to achieve since the day I'd decided to stop being invisible. As I stood in the renovated lobby of the historic building, surrounded by people whose lives had been positively affected by our work, I reflected on the long path from that humiliating moment in the Meridian Tower conference room to this celebration of shared achievement. The woman who had once emptied trash cans while dreams dismissed her potential had built something that created opportunities for dozens of other people to realize their own potential. The business continued to grow, but I made sure that growth never came at the expense of the values that had guided us from the beginning. We remained committed to treating everyone with respect, giving people second chances when they demonstrated genuine commitment to change, and proving that success in business could be achieved through positive relationships rather than exploitation or dismissal of others. Sandra, who had started as a symbol of the attitudes I was trying to change, became one of our most effective advocates for the company's approach to employee and tenant relations. She often spoke to new hires about her own transformation and the importance of recognizing potential in people, regardless of their current circumstances or past mistakes. The accounting firm that had once employed Sandra and several other businesses that had initially been skeptical of our management style eventually became some of our most satisfied tenants. They discovered that working with a property management company that prioritized communication, fairness, and mutual respect made their own operations more efficient and their employees more satisfied with their work environments. Looking back on the entire journey, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about real estate or business management. It was about the power of persistence and the importance of maintaining dignity, regardless of how others choose to treat you. The woman who had been mocked for her dreams had not only achieved those dreams, but had used them to create opportunities for others who faced similar challenges and dismissive attitudes. Every morning when I unlocked the doors of our buildings, I thought about my mama's advice that taking pride in your work, no matter what it is, always leads to something better if you keep your eyes open for opportunities. She'd been right about that, but she'd also taught me something else that had proven equally valuable: that treating people with kindness and respect, regardless of their current circumstances, was not just the right thing to do, but also the foundation for building something lasting and meaningful. The cleaning lady who had once been invisible had become someone who helped others become visible, valued, and successful. And in a world that often seemed determined to dismiss people based on superficial judgments, that felt like the most important achievement of all. The moment that brought everything full circle happened on a rainy Thursday morning, 3 years after the fraud trials had ended. I was walking through the lobby of the Meridian Tower, checking on some renovation work we were doing to update the elevator systems, when I noticed a familiar figure struggling with several boxes of personal belongings near the security desk. It was Sandra from the accounting firm, the same woman who used to leave passive-aggressive notes about my cleaning, and had been one of the most condescending tenants during my invisible years. She looked exhausted and frustrated, clearly in the middle of moving her belongings out of the building. When she saw me approaching, I could see the recognition in her eyes, followed immediately by what looked like embarrassment. We hadn't spoken directly since the day I'd revealed my ownership of the building, and I could tell she was uncertain about how to interact with me now that our roles had completely reversed. I asked if she needed help with the boxes, and she explained that her firm was closing down after losing several major clients and struggling with cash flow problems for over a year. The partners had decided to dissolve the business rather than continue operating at a loss, and she was clearing out her personal items before the office furniture was repossessed. There was something in her voice that reminded me of how I'd felt during my most difficult financial periods, and despite our history, I found myself feeling sympathetic. Sandra hesitated for a moment, then asked if she could speak with me privately about something that had been bothering her for a long time. We went to the small coffee shop in the building's ground floor, and she spent several minutes apologizing for how she'd treated me during my cleaning years. She said she'd been going through her own struggles with job insecurity and financial stress, and that taking out her frustrations on someone she perceived as having less power had made her feel temporarily better about her own situation. What surprised me was how genuine her apology seemed. She wasn't trying to get something from me or manipulate me into helping with her current problems. She was simply acknowledging that her behavior had been wrong and that she'd realized it more clearly as her own circumstances had deteriorated. She told me that watching my transformation from cleaning lady to successful property owner had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own attitudes and assumptions. I accepted her apology, and we ended up talking for over an hour about how people's circumstances can change quickly and unpredictably. She shared that she'd been applying for bookkeeping positions but was having trouble finding work that paid enough to cover her basic expenses. The accounting field had become more competitive, and her experience was with smaller firms that didn't provide the kind of credentials that larger companies were looking for. Before we parted ways, I mentioned that our property management company was looking for someone with accounting experience to help manage the financial aspects of our expanding portfolio. We needed someone who could handle tenant billing, expense tracking, and financial reporting for multiple properties, and her background seemed like it might be a good fit. I gave her my business card and suggested she submit a resume if she was interested in learning more about the position. Elena was skeptical when I told her about my conversation with Sandra and my suggestion that she apply for our open position. She reminded me that Sandra had been one of the people who'd treated me most poorly during my cleaning years, and she questioned whether someone with that attitude would be a good cultural fit for our company. Miguel was more neutral but agreed that we should be careful about hiring someone whose past behavior suggested she might not respect all members of our team. I understood their concerns, but I also believed that people could change, and that Sandra's apology had seemed sincere. More importantly, I thought there might be value in having someone on our team who had personally experienced the kind of attitude transformation that we hoped to encourage in the broader business community. If Sandra could become a positive example of how people could grow beyond their initial prejudices, it might help other employees and tenants do the same. Sandra submitted her resume within 2 days, along with a cover letter that was more thoughtful and humble than I'd expected. She acknowledged her past behavior directly, explained what she'd learned from the experience, and outlined how her accounting skills could contribute to our company's continued growth. She also mentioned that she'd researched our business practices and was impressed by our reputation for treating all employees and tenants with respect. We interviewed Sandra along with 4 other candidates for the position, and she performed well on both the technical aspects of the job and the interpersonal questions we used to assess cultural fit. She was honest about her past attitudes and articulated clearly how her perspective had changed. She also demonstrated genuine enthusiasm for our company's mission and values, which seemed authentic rather than calculated. After discussing it extensively with Elena and Miguel, we decided to offer Sandra the position with a probationary period that would allow us to evaluate her performance and attitude over several months. We made it clear that any behavior that disrespected colleagues or tenants would result in immediate termination, and she agreed to those terms without hesitation. Sandra's integration into our team exceeded my expectations. She was professional, diligent, and respectful in all her interactions with employees and tenants. She also brought valuable organizational skills that helped us streamline our financial processes and improve our reporting capabilities. Most importantly, she seemed genuinely committed to contributing to the positive culture we'd worked to create. Her transformation became a powerful example for other employees and tenants who had initially been skeptical about our management approach. When someone who had previously embodied the kind of dismissive attitude we were trying to change could adapt and thrive in our environment, it demonstrated that our values weren't just idealistic concepts, but practical guidelines that could work for everyone. The success of Sandra's hiring led us to be more open to giving second chances to other people who had made mistakes or shown poor judgment in the past, as long as they demonstrated genuine willingness to change and contributed positively to our team dynamics. We developed interview processes that focused more on current attitudes and future potential than on past behavior, while still maintaining high standards for professionalism and respect. Our reputation for fair treatment and second chances started attracting job applicants who had been struggling to find work due to various challenges in their backgrounds. We hired a former tenant who had been evicted from another building due to financial problems but had gotten back on his feet, a maintenance worker who had been fired from his previous job due to personality conflicts but showed excellent technical skills, and an administrative assistant who had been unemployed for over a year due to age discrimination in her previous field. Building a team of people who had faced various forms of professional adversity created a work environment that was more empathetic, collaborative, and motivated than any I'd experienced before. Everyone understood what it felt like to be underestimated or dismissed, which made them more committed to treating others with dignity and working together to achieve shared goals. The business benefits of this approach were significant. Our employee turnover was virtually non-existent. Our customer service ratings were consistently high, and our reputation for positive workplace culture helped us attract both tenants and investors who wanted to be associated with companies that demonstrated strong values in their operations. But the personal satisfaction of building something that reflected my own values and experiences was even more important than the financial success. Every day when I walked through our properties and saw employees who had been given opportunities to prove themselves, tenants who felt respected and supported, and spaces that were well-maintained and efficiently operated, I felt proud of what we'd accomplished together. The culmination of this approach came when we were approached by the city's Economic Development Department about participating in a downtown revitalization initiative. They were looking for property management companies that could take on challenging buildings in underdeveloped areas and transform them into thriving commercial spaces that would attract new businesses and create jobs. The project they offered us was a historic building that had been vacant for over 5 years due to a combination of structural problems, environmental issues, and a location that was considered undesirable by most commercial tenants. The building had beautiful architecture and good bones, but it would require significant investment and creative thinking to make it viable in the current market. Elena, Miguel, and I spent weeks analyzing the opportunity and developing a renovation plan that would preserve the building's historic character while updating it for modern business needs. We proposed creating a mixed-use space that would include traditional office suites, co-working areas for entrepreneurs and freelancers, and ground-floor retail space for local businesses that couldn't afford prime downtown rents. The city approved our proposal and offered favorable financing terms that made the project financially feasible. We also received support from several community organizations that were interested in promoting economic development in the area. The renovation project became our most ambitious undertaking yet, requiring us to coordinate with historic preservation specialists, environmental remediation contractors, and a variety of regulatory agencies. The building's transformation took 18 months and attracted significant media attention as an example of how thoughtful property management could contribute to broader community development goals. We were able to lease the spaces to a diverse mix of tenants, including a nonprofit organization, several small technology companies, a coffee shop, and a bookstore that specialized in works by local authors. The success of the historic building project established our company as a leader in adaptive reuse and community-focused development. We started receiving invitations to bid on similar projects in other cities, and several universities asked me to speak to their real estate and urban planning students about strategies for revitalizing underutilized commercial properties. But beyond the business recognition, the historic building project created something even more meaningful. It became a symbol of transformation that resonated with people throughout the community who had experienced their own struggles with being overlooked or undervalued. Local media covered the story not just as a real estate success, but as an example of how determination and vision could turn forgotten spaces into thriving centers of activity. The building housed Maria's nonprofit organization that provided job training for people transitioning out of homelessness, a technology startup founded by 3 women who had struggled to find investors willing to take them seriously, and a coffee shop owned by a refugee family who had been searching for an affordable location to start their business. Each tenant had their own story of overcoming challenges and proving their worth despite initial skepticism from others. I made it a point to spend time in the building regularly, not just for management purposes but to observe how the different businesses were thriving and supporting each other. The coffee shop became a gathering place for the technology workers, who often mentored participants in the job training program. The bookstore hosted evening events that brought together people from throughout the neighborhood, creating a sense of community that extended far beyond the building itself. Watching these connections develop reminded me of the importance of creating spaces where people could discover unexpected opportunities and form relationships that might not have existed otherwise. The building had become more than just a collection of rented offices. It had become a catalyst for personal and professional growth that reflected the same transformation I'd experienced in my own journey. One afternoon while visiting the building, I encountered a young woman named Keisha who was participating in Maria's job training program. She was clearly nervous about an upcoming interview for an administrative position with one of the technology companies, and she asked if I had any advice for someone who felt like potential employers might not take her seriously due to her background. I told her about my own experience of being dismissed and underestimated, and how I'd learned that the best response was to focus on demonstrating competence and reliability, rather than trying to convince people to change their preconceptions. I also shared that sometimes being underestimated could actually be an advantage, because it meant that exceeding expectations would have an even greater impact. Keisha got the job, and she became one of the most valued employees at the technology company. 6 months later, she approached me about the possibility of starting her own business providing virtual assistant services to small companies that couldn't afford full-time administrative staff. She had identified a gap in the market and developed a business plan that showed real potential for success. I introduced Keisha to Elena, who helped her understand the financial aspects of starting a business, and to Miguel, who explained the practical considerations of setting up a home office. We also connected her with several other entrepreneurs in our buildings who were willing to serve as her first clients and provide references for future marketing efforts. Keisha's virtual assistant business grew rapidly, and within a year she was able to hire 2 other people from Maria's job training program as part-time employees. Her success became another example of how providing opportunities and support could create ripple effects that benefited multiple people in the community. Stories like Keisha's reinforced my belief that the most important aspect of business success wasn't just financial achievement, but the ability to create opportunities for others to achieve their own goals. Every time someone in our building started a new business, got promoted, or found stability after a period of struggle, it validated the approach we'd taken to building something meaningful rather than just profitable. The recognition from the historic building project led to an invitation that would have seemed impossible during my cleaning days. The mayor asked me to serve on a task force focused on affordable housing and economic development, bringing together business leaders, community advocates, and city officials to develop strategies for addressing some of the city's most persistent challenges. Participating in policy discussions at the city level was intimidating at first, because most of the other task force members had advanced degrees and extensive experience in government or large corporations. But I quickly realized that my perspective as someone who had experienced economic insecurity firsthand, combined with my practical knowledge of property management and community development, provided insights that complemented the more theoretical approaches others were proposing. The task force spent 6 months developing recommendations that balanced the need for economic development with the importance of preserving affordable options for working families and small businesses. My contributions focused on strategies for maintaining mixed-income communities and preventing gentrification from displacing long-term residents and local businesses. One of the recommendations I championed was the creation of a fund that would provide low-interest loans to property owners who committed to maintaining affordable rents while improving building conditions. The program would be structured to reward property managers who demonstrated excellence in tenant relations and building maintenance, rather than simply offering subsidies without accountability measures. The mayor incorporated several of our recommendations into her housing policy agenda, and the city council approved funding for a pilot program based on the loan fund concept I'd proposed. Being able to influence policy at that level felt surreal, considering that just a few years earlier I'd been someone whose opinions weren't considered worth hearing even in casual conversations. But the most satisfying aspect of the task force work was the relationships I developed with other community leaders who shared similar values and goals. We formed an informal network that continued to collaborate on various projects, even after the official task force concluded. These connections led to new business opportunities, joint ventures, and ongoing advocacy efforts that amplified the impact we could have individually. Through this network, I met Dr. Patricia Williams, a professor at the local university who had been researching the economic impacts of gentrification and displacement. She was interested in studying our approach to community-focused property management as a potential model for other cities facing similar challenges. Dr. Williams spent several months documenting our business practices, interviewing tenants and employees, and analyzing the financial performance of our properties compared to similar buildings managed by other companies. Her research confirmed that our approach was not only ethically sound, but also financially viable, producing strong returns while maintaining high tenant satisfaction and low turnover rates. The study became the basis for a case study that Dr. Williams presented at urban planning conferences throughout the country. Her research helped validate the idea that property management companies could be profitable, while also contributing positively to community development and social equity goals. The academic attention led to invitations to speak at conferences and workshops, where I could share our experiences with other property managers, community developers, and policymakers. These speaking opportunities were initially nerve-wracking, but I found that audiences were genuinely interested in practical strategies for balancing business success with social responsibility. At one conference in Chicago, I met a group of property managers from Detroit who were working to revitalize neighborhoods that had been abandoned during the city's economic decline. They were facing many of the same challenges we'd encountered with our historic building project, and they wanted to learn from our approach to tenant selection, community engagement, and financing strategies. I spent a weekend in Detroit visiting their properties and meeting with local community leaders, business owners, and residents. The scale of the challenges there was much larger than anything we'd dealt with, but the fundamental principles were the same: treating people with respect, focusing on long-term sustainability rather than short-term profits, and building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. The Detroit trip inspired me to think more systematically about how our experiences could be applied in other contexts. Elena, Miguel, and I began discussing the possibility of expanding our operations to other cities, either through direct investment or by partnering with local developers who shared our values and approach. We decided to start small, with a consultation project in a mid-sized city about 3 hours from our home base. A community development corporation there had acquired several buildings in their downtown area and was looking for guidance on renovation strategies and tenant selection approaches that would support their neighborhood revitalization goals. The consultation work was challenging because it required us to adapt our methods to different local conditions, regulations, and community dynamics. But it was also rewarding because it proved that our approach could be successful in different contexts and could help other communities address their own development challenges. The success of the consultation project led to additional opportunities in other cities, and we gradually developed a consulting division of our business that specialized in community-focused property development. This work allowed us to have a broader impact, while also generating additional revenue that we could reinvest in our local properties and community initiatives. But even as our business expanded and evolved, I made sure never to lose sight of the personal experiences that had shaped my understanding of what success really meant. Every major decision was evaluated not just on financial criteria, but on whether it aligned with our commitment to treating people with dignity and creating opportunities for others to improve their own circumstances. The woman who had once been invisible while emptying trash cans had become someone whose opinions were sought by mayors, professors, and business leaders throughout the region. But the most important validation came from the employees, tenants, and community members whose lives had been positively affected by the work we'd done together. Sandra, who had started as a symbol of the attitudes I was trying to change, became one of our most effective advocates for the company's approach to employee and tenant relations. She often spoke to new hires about her own transformation and the importance of recognizing potential in people regardless of their current circumstances or past mistakes. The accounting firm that had once employed Sandra and several other businesses that had initially been skeptical of our management style eventually became some of our most satisfied tenants. They discovered that working with a property management company that prioritized communication, fairness, and mutual respect made their own operations more efficient, and their employees more satisfied with their work environments. Looking back on the entire journey, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about real estate or business management. It was about the power of persistence and the importance of maintaining dignity regardless of how others choose to treat you. The woman who had been mocked for her dreams had not only achieved those dreams, but had used them to create opportunities for others who faced similar challenges and dismissive attitudes. Every morning when I unlocked the doors of our buildings, I thought about my mama's advice that taking pride in your work, no matter what it is, always leads to something better if you keep your eyes open for opportunities. She'd been right about that, but she'd also taught me something else that had proven equally valuable, that treating people with kindness and respect, regardless of their current circumstances, was not just the right thing to do but also the foundation for building something lasting and meaningful. The cleaning lady who had once been invisible had become someone who helped others become visible, valued, and successful. And in a world that often seemed determined to dismiss people based on superficial judgments, that felt like the most important achievement of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.